I thank the ranking member for his remarks. Ambassador Sondland, thank you for your testimony today. This is a seminal moment in our investigation, and the evidence you have brought forward is deeply significant and troubling. It's been a long hearing, and I know Americans watching throughout the country may not have had the opportunity to watch all of it. So I'm going to go through a few of the highlights, and I'm not going to try to paraphrase what you've said. I'm going to refer to your opening statement. We all understood that if we refused to work with Mr. Giuliani, we would lose an important opportunity to cement relations between the United States and Ukraine. So we followed the President's orders. Mr. Giuliani's requests were a quid pro quo for arranging a White House visit for President Zelensky. Mr. Giuliani demanded that Ukraine make a public statement announcing investigations of the 2016 election, DNC server, and Burisma. Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and we knew that these investigations were important to the President. Later, you testified, I tried diligently to ask why the aid was suspended, but I never received a clear answer. In the absence of any credible explanation for the suspension of aid, I later came to believe that the resumption of security aid would not occur until there was a public statement from Ukraine committing to the investigations of the 2016 election and Burisma, as Mr. Giuliani had demanded. I shared concerns of the potential quid pro quo regarding the security aid with Senator Ron Johnson, and I also shared my concern with the Ukrainians. So much for the Ukrainians didn't know. You can't have a quid pro quo unless the Ukrainians know, and you have testified today, Ambassador, the Ukrainians knew. You further testified Mr. Giuliani emphasized that the President wanted a public statement from President Zelensky committing Ukraine to look into corruption issues. Mr. Giuliani specifically mentioned the 2016 election, including the DNC server and Burisma, as two topics of importance to the President. In reference to the July 10th meeting at the White House, which you attended with Ambassador Bolton and others and the Ukrainian delegation, you said, I recall mentioning the prerequisite of investigations before any White House call or meeting. You further testified, again, Mr. Giuliani's demand that President Zelensky make a public statement about investigations. I knew that the topic of investigations was important to President Trump. You testified later, I know that members of this committee have frequently framed these complicated issues in the form of a simple question. Was there a quid pro quo? As I testified previously, with regard to the requested White House call and White House meeting, the answer is yes. We all understood these prerequisites for the White House call and White House meeting reflected President Trump's desires and requirements. Later, on the subject of security aid, you testified, in the absence of any credible explanation for the hold, I came to the conclusion that the aid, like the White House visit, was jeopardized. In preparation for the September 1 meeting in Warsaw, I asked Secretary Pompeo whether a face-to-face conversation between Trump with Zelensky could help break the logjam. And this is from an email that the State Department refuses to provide to us, but you have provided to us, Ambassador. It reads, should we block time in Warsaw for a short pull-aside for POTUS to meet Zelensky? I would ask Zelensky to look him in the eye, that is the President, and tell him that once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place in mid-September, that Z should be able to move forward publicly with confidence on those issues of importance to POTUS and to the United States. Hopefully, that will break the logjam. And Secretary Pompeo's reply Yes. Not what issues of importance to the POTUS, not what are you talking about, Ambassador Sondland, because Secretary Pompeo was on the July 25th phone call. He knew what issues were important to POTUS, and there were two of them: the investigation into 2016 and the DNC server, and the investigation into the Bidens. By the end of August, you testified, my belief was that if Ukraine did something to demonstrate a serious intention to fight corruption, specifically addressing Burisma and the 2016 server, then the hold on military aid would be lifted. I mentioned to Vice President Pence before the meetings with Ukrainians that I had concerns that the delay in aid had become tied to the issue of investigations. And as you testified, he gave you no response. No, what are you talking about, Ambassador? How could that be, Ambassador? How do we clear this up, Ambassador? He merely nodded his head or took it in. And of course, the record of that 25th call between President Trump and Zelensky was in the Vice President's reading book earlier. Then you testified, my goal at the time was to do what was necessary to get the aid released, to break the logjam. I believe that the public statement we had been discussing for weeks was essential to advancing that goal. Now, my colleagues seem to believe, and let me add too about this call you had with the President, you have confirmed today, in addition to claiming there was no quid pro quo, the President was adamant that President Zelensky had to, quote, clear things up and do it in public. That's what you have confirmed. That is what you also told Ambassador Taylor. So he would deny there was a quid pro quo, but he was adamant that Zelensky had to, quote, clear things up and do it in public. Now, I've said a lot of things about President Trump over the years. I have very strong feelings about President Trump, which are neither here nor there. But I will say this on the President's behalf. I do not believe that the President would allow himself to be led by the nose by Rudy Giuliani or Ambassador Sondland or anybody else. I think the President was the one who decided whether a meeting would happen, whether aid would be lifted, not anyone who worked for him. And so the answer to the question, who was refusing the meeting with Zelensky that you believe should take place, and Ambassador Volker believes should take place, and everybody believes should take place? The only question was when. Who was the one standing in the way of that meeting? Who was the one refusing to take that meeting? There's only one answer to that question, and it's Donald J. Trump, 45th President of the United States. So who was holding up the military assistance? Was it you, Ambassador Sondland? No, it wasn't. Was it Ambassador Volker? No. Was it Ambassador Taylor? No. Was it Deputy Secretary Kent? No. Was it Secretary of State Pompeo? No. Who had the decision to release the aid? It was one person, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States. Now, my colleagues seem to think unless the President says the magic words, I hereby bribe the Ukrainians, that there's no evidence of bribery or other high crimes or misdemeanors. But let's look to the best evidence of what's in the President's head. What's his intent? What's the reason behind the hold, on the meeting, and on the aid? Let's look at what the President has to say. Let's look at what's undisputed about what the President has to say. And you know how we know what the President has to say? Not because what you have represented or others have represented, but because we have a record of his conversation. And with who? The one who really matters. With the other president, Zelensky. And this is what he says. He says, Rudy very much knows what's happening. And he is a very capable guy. This is after he says he wants a favor. And he goes into CrowdStrike in 2016. He says, Rudy very much knows what's happening and is a very capable guy. If you could speak to him, that would be great. The former ambassador from the United States, the woman was bad news. And the people she was dealing with in Ukraine were bad news. So I just want to let you know that. The other thing, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son. that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that, so whatever you can do with the Attorney General, that would be great. Biden went about bragging that he stopped the prosecution, so if you could look into it, it sounds horrible to me. So what's in the president's mind when he has placed this otherwise inexplicable hold on the aid, when he refuses to take the meeting? What's on his mind? Biden. He makes that abundantly clear. I understand, Ambassador, you said you didn't make the connection between Burisma and Biden. I will let the American people judge the credibility of that answer. But there's no mistaking what Donald Trump's interest was. There's no mistaking about what Donald Trump meant when he had that call with you on an unsecure phone as you're sitting there in an outdoor terrace in Ukraine. When the president said investigation, he meant Biden. He made that abundantly clear to the president of Ukraine the day before. The question is not what the president meant. The question is not whether he was responsible for holding up the aid. He was. The question is not whether everybody knew it. Apparently they did. The question is, what are we prepared to do about it? Is there any accountability? Or are we forced to conclude that this is just now the world that we live in, when a president of the United States can withhold vital military aid from an ally at war with the Russians, an ally fighting our fight too, to defend our country against Russian aggression? Are we prepared to say, in the words of Mick Mulvaney, get over it or get used to it? We are not prepared to say that. We're not prepared to say that. And I appreciate Ambassador Volker, Ambassador Sondland, I appreciate the fact that you have not opined on whether the president should be impeached or not be impeached, or whether the crime of bribery or the impeachable offense of bribery or other high crimes and misdemeanors has been committed. That is for us to decide in consultation with our constituents and our conscience. That is for us to decide. And much as my colleagues have said otherwise, this is not an easy decision for any of us. And much as my colleagues may say otherwise, this is not something we relish. For over a year, I resisted this whole idea of going down the road to impeachment. But it was made necessary, and not by the whistleblower, but by the actions of the president. I'm continually struck how my colleagues would suggest that because the president got caught, we should ignore the fact that he was conditioning official acts in order to get political favors, in order to get an investigation against his rival. Getting caught is no defense, not to a violation of the Constitution or to a violation of his oath of office, and it certainly doesn't give us a reason to ignore our own oath of office. We are adjourned.